He bought the land at a low price and didn't expect anything unusual. But deep on the property, the farmer found an old mossy house hidden in the hillside. What was inside explained the strange history of this land and changed his life. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments which city or country you're watching from. The land had appeared on his screen late at night, tucked between listings that were either far beyond his means or burdened with obvious flaws. At first glance, it looked ordinary enough, several dozen acres at the edge of a limestone ridge, bordered by forest on one side and open fields on the other. What made it impossible to ignore was the price. Comparable parcels in the region sold for nearly twice as much, sometimes more. Yet this one had been sitting untouched for months, quietly reduced again and again, until it seemed less like an opportunity and more like a question no one wanted to answer. He had learned long ago not to trust luck without examining it closely. Farming had taught him that nothing came cheaply without demanding payment later, whether in labor, patience, or consequences that only revealed themselves with time. Still, the numbers did not lie. The soil surveys were decent, the rainfall steady, the access road serviceable. From a practical standpoint, the land made sense, and the discount, though unsettling, could be explained away by any number of mundane reasons. Distance from town, a seller in a hurry, a piece of ground that simply failed to attract attention. When he contacted the agent, the conversation was brief and strangely efficient. There was no enthusiasm, no effort to dress the property up with romantic language. The man on the other end of the line answered questions plainly and seemed eager to move on, as if the sale itself were a formality he wished to complete and forget. The explanation for the price came easily enough. The current owner needed to relocate quickly, and the land had been more trouble than it was worth. Taxes, upkeep, no time to manage it properly, nothing that raised an obvious red flag, yet nothing that fully settled the unease either. He visited the property a week later. The drive took him farther from the paved roads and into a stretch of countryside where the land rose gently and the forests thickened, the limestone ridge appearing in the distance like a pale scar along the horizon. Standing at the edge of the parcel, he took his time walking the boundaries, letting his boots sink into the soil, studying the way water pooled in the low spots and drained from the higher ground. The fields were open enough for planting, the tree line dense but not impenetrable. The ridge itself offered shelter from prevailing winds, and the slope faced the sun in a way that promised long, even days of light. It was the kind of land that rewarded patience. He could picture rows of crops stretching toward the tree line, equipment sheds placed carefully to avoid runoff, a farmhouse set back just far enough to feel private without being isolated. The quiet appealed to him more than he liked to admit. After years of working rented land and negotiating with owners who saw fields as numbers rather than living ground, the idea of something that was entirely his felt grounding almost necessary. The paperwork reflected what he had already been told. There were no recorded structures, no easements, no disputes. Ownership passed cleanly from one name to another, though the timeline seemed oddly thin, with long stretches where the land appeared untouched, then suddenly transferred again after only a few years. He noted it, made a mental mark to look into it later, and continued reading. On paper, there was nothing to stop him. He signed. The first weeks after the purchase were consumed by the usual tasks: clearing brush, marking future planting areas, testing soil, bringing in equipment. The land responded well at first, almost eagerly, as if relieved to be worked again. Grass bent beneath the tires of his tractor, insects scattered, Birds lifted and resettled along the fence line. It felt alive in the way good land always did, responsive and honest. It was near the limestone ridge that the first oddities emerged. The ground there resisted him in small but persistent ways. When he tried to level a narrow strip for future access, the tractor lurched unexpectedly, one wheel sinking slightly before catching again. He climbed down, expecting soft soil or a hidden rock, but found neither. The earth felt firm beneath his boots, yet when he drove a metal rod into it, the resistance changed abruptly a foot below the surface, as if he had struck a hollow pocket rather than solid ground. He marked the spot and moved on, only to encounter the same thing again 20 yards away. Then again, the pattern bothered him. Natural sinkholes and voids were not unheard of in limestone country, but they rarely arranged themselves so neatly. After a rainfall, these areas behaved differently as well. Water drained faster there, leaving the surface dry while surrounding soil remained dark and damp. Grass grew thinner, its color just a shade paler, as if something beneath was altering the ground above it. As he worked, he became more aware of the land under his feet in a way that went beyond sight. Certain areas sounded different when he walked across them, his steps producing a faintly hollow note that vanished as soon as he moved on. At night, when the wind shifted and moved through the ridge, he thought he could hear subtle changes in the sound it made, a low, uneven resonance that seemed to come from below rather than across the surface. He told himself not to read too much into it. Limestone landscapes were full of quirks, and experience had taught him that imagination often filled gaps that knowledge had not yet reached. Still, he began keeping informal notes, sketching rough maps of where the soil behaved strangely, where equipment faltered, where water refused to linger. Without quite meaning to, he found his attention drawn repeatedly to the same section of land at the base of the ridge. There were other signs, smaller and easier to dismiss. Old metal stakes half buried along the forest edge, too rusted to identify and placed in a curve that did not match any modern boundary. Faint depressions running through the undergrowth, barely visible unless the light struck them at the right angle, suggesting paths that had once been walked often enough to wear the ground down. They led toward the ridge and then simply disappeared, swallowed by brush and stone. When he mentioned the land casually to a neighboring farmer, the conversation stalled. The man shrugged, offered a vague comment about the ridge being difficult ground, and changed the subject. Another neighbor laughed softly and said the land had always been restless, a word that sounded more like a habit than a belief. No one offered specifics. No one asked questions. It was as if the parcel existed just far enough outside the shared narrative of the area to be ignored. The deeper he moved into his work, the more he felt that the land was uneven in ways that had nothing to do with geology. Not hostile, exactly, but reserved, as if it had been shaped by intentions that were no longer visible. He found himself slowing down near the ridge, listening more carefully, testing the ground before committing weight to it. At night, he lay awake in the small trailer he used while preparing the land, replaying the day's discoveries in his mind and telling himself repeatedly that there were always explanations. Yet the sense of something withheld persisted. It was not fear, not yet, but a growing awareness that the land had been altered deliberately at some point in its past. Whatever had happened here had not left dramatic scars. No ruins stood in plain sight. No stories circulated openly. Instead, there was absence. Clean records, quiet neighbors. A price that discouraged curiosity by rewarding silence. By the time he finished mapping the first planting area, His attention had narrowed almost unconsciously towards the slope of the ridge. He did not yet know what he was looking for, only that the answers to his questions were not spread evenly across the land. They clustered there, beneath the pale stone and the thin layer of soil, in a place that resisted both machinery and easy explanations. Standing at the edge of the field one evening, watching the light fade across the ridge, he felt a subtle shift in his understanding of the purchase he had made. The land was not empty. It had simply been quiet for a very long time, and whatever lay beneath its surface had waded through ownership changes, through decades of neglect and brief attempts at use, until someone finally stayed long enough to notice that the ground itself was trying, in its own restrained way, to be remembered. The ridge drew him back again and again in the days that followed, not through any deliberate decision, but through a quiet insistence that settled somewhere beneath conscious thought. Each morning he planned his work elsewhere, telling himself he would return to the uneven ground later, once more practical matters were settled. And each afternoon he found himself drifting towards the base of the limestone slope, tools in hand, attention narrowing as the light shifted and revealed details he had somehow missed before. It was during one of these unplanned returns that he first noticed the hill that was not a hill. At a distance, it blended perfectly into the ridge. The slope rose gently, its surface covered in grass, low shrubs, and a thick quilt of moss that followed the natural contours of the land. Nothing about it demanded notice. Yet, as he approached from below, walking along a line he had marked earlier, the geometry of the rise began to feel wrong. The curve was too even, the crest too deliberate. The grass grew differently there, shorter and more uniform, as if rooted in a layer of soil that did not quite belong. He stopped several yards away and studied it from different angles, shifting his position slowly, letting the afternoon sun cast long shadows. Only then did the outline reveal itself. What he had taken for a natural swell in the earth had edges, faint but unmistakable, where the slope broke at subtle right angles before softening again beneath decades of growth. The structure was not exposed. It was disguised patiently and effectively by time itself. When he stepped closer, his boot brushed against a section where the moss gave way to something firmer beneath. He knelt and pressed his palm against the surface. The ground did not yield as it should have. Beneath the thin soil layer was something solid, something that did not shift or crumble under pressure. He scraped gently with a gloved hand, careful not to damage whatever lay beneath, and uncovered a patch of tightly packed sod resting on a surface that felt distinctly flat. His pulse quickened, not with fear, but with recognition. This was not erosion. This was construction. Working slowly, he cleared a wider section, revealing the unmistakable curve of a roof buried deliberately under earth and vegetation. It was low, built to avoid attention, its profile hugging the land rather than rising from it. The sod had been laid carefully, layer upon layer, until the structure disappeared into the ridge itself. From a few steps away, it vanished completely, reclaimed by grass and shadow. The sides were harder to trace, but persistence paid off. As he followed the slope toward the ridge, he found stonework where the stone should not have been. Blocks fitted together without mortar, their seams softened by time but still legible to the eye. The stones were of the same limestone that formed the ridge, cut and shaped to match it so closely that they became nearly invisible once weathered. He circled the structure slowly, taking it in piece by piece. It was not large, not the kind of building meant to be seen or admired. It was functional, restrained, and purposeful. Whoever built it had understood the land intimately and had gone to great lengths to ensure that the finished result appeared natural, inevitable, as if it had always been there. The entrance revealed itself only after he had nearly given up looking for it. A darker recess in the stone, partially obscured by a fallen branch and a tangle of vines, resolved into a doorway so low he had to crouch to examine it. The wood was old, its surface rough and gray, reinforced with iron straps that had long since rusted into the grain. There was no handle, no latch visible from the outside, only a narrow gap where the door met the frame. He hesitated before touching it. The land around him was silent, the kind of deep, layered quiet that came only from distance and disuse. No road noise reached this far. No voices. Only the faint rustle of leaves higher up the ridge and the sound of his own breathing. When he pushed, the door resisted at first, then shifted inward with a sound that was more sigh than creak. The interior was dark, cool, and dry, the air carrying the faint scent of earth and old wood. He stepped inside cautiously, allowing his eyes to adjust. The space within was sparse. A single room, low-ceilinged and narrow, its walls a combination of stone and timber. The floor was hard-packed earth, worn smooth by use. Along one wall stood a rough table, its surface scarred by years of work. Shelves lined another, holding the remnants of containers that had long since collapsed or been carried away. An old iron stove sat cold and empty near the back, its pipe disappearing into the stone above. What struck him most was not what was present, but what was absent. There was no sign of violent damage, no indication that the place had been ransacked or burned. The decay he saw was slow and patient, the kind that came from time rather than force. Objects lay where they had been left, not scattered, not overturned. A cracked mug rested on the table. A length of rope hung from a peg by the door. It felt as though whoever had lived here had simply stood up one day and walked away. He moved carefully through the room, noting details as he went. The construction was practical, even ingenious in places. The stone walls thickened toward the ridge, providing insulation and stability. Small openings near the ceiling allowed light and air to filter in without revealing the interior to anyone outside. Everything about the space suggested restraint and intention. Yet the sense of incompleteness lingered. A place like this should have had more. Storage, a cellar, somewhere to keep supplies safe and hidden. The room felt like an antechamber rather than a home, a surface presence meant to disguise something larger. His attention was drawn to the floor near the center of the room, where the dirt appeared slightly darker, more compacted. A scrap of fabric lay there, half rotted and stiff with age, its pattern barely visible beneath the dust. He nudged it aside with his boot, and the sound changed abruptly. Beneath the thin layer of soil was metal. He knelt again, brushing away dirt until a dull, rusted surface emerged, unmistakably artificial. A seam ran along one edge, precise and straight, disappearing beneath the floor. The fabric, he realized, had once been a rug, laid carefully to hide what lay beneath. The realization settled slowly, bringing with it a shift in the weight of the room. This was not merely a forgotten dwelling, it was a cover. He stood and took a step back, letting the full implication sink in. The absence of the structure from official records, the strange behavior of the ground, the deliberate silence of neighbors. All of it pointed toward this moment. Toward the discovery of something that had never been meant to be found casually, if at all. He left the room as he had found it, pulling the door closed and stepping back into the fading light. From the outside, the structure vanished again into the ridge, its presence erased by shadow and vegetation. He marked the location carefully, committing it to memory rather than leaving obvious signs. That night, as he reviewed old property maps and digital records once more, the omission stood out more starkly than ever. The land was described as undeveloped across every document he could access. There was no hint of construction, past or present. Even older survey maps showed only the ridge, sketched as a continuous natural feature without interruption. The conclusion was unavoidable. The sod house had not simply been forgotten, it had been excluded. By the time he shut down his computer, the questions had multiplied beyond easy dismissal. Who had built the structure, and why had they gone to such lengths to hide it? Why leave behind a place so carefully made without fire or ruin to explain its abandonment? And, most unsettling of all, what lay beneath the metal he had uncovered, sealed away beneath a floor that had been meant to be walked across without a second thought. Sleep came late and lightly. His dreams were filled with images of buried spaces and closed doors, of rooms beneath rooms, of history pressed flat beneath layers of earth and silence. When morning arrived, it carried with it not relief but a steady resolve. Whatever waited below that sod-covered roof was no longer just a curiosity of the land. It was part of the land's story, and, by extension, part of his own. He returned to the ridge at first light, tools packed carefully, movements deliberate. The surface had revealed its secret. The deeper truth, he suspected, waited just beyond the rusted edge of the metal hidden beneath that quiet, unassuming room. Morning light reached the base of the ridge slowly, filtering through the trees and catching on the pale limestone long before it touched the ground below. He arrived early, earlier than he had planned, drawn by a sense of momentum he could not easily explain. The sod-covered structure looked unchanged in the dawn light, its outline once again dissolving into the slope as if the discovery of the day before had been no more than a trick of shadow and imagination. Yet he knew better now. Once seen, it could not be unseen. Inside, the air felt the same as before, cool, dry, preserved. Dust motes hung briefly in the beam of his flashlight before settling again, undisturbed. The room greeted him with the quiet familiarity of a place that had been entered before and left respectfully. Nothing had shifted overnight. Nothing had collapsed. The stillness seemed intentional, almost guarded. His attention returned immediately to the center of the floor, to the place where the worn scrap of fabric lay half-folded, its purpose finally understood. He knelt beside it and lifted it carefully, resisting the urge to pull or tear. Beneath, the outline of the metal was clearer in the morning light. The surface was mottled with rust, darkened by age, but the shape was unmistakable. This was no improvised hatch, no casual covering. It was a door. He brushed away more dirt with slow, deliberate movements. The metal extended farther than he had first realized, its edges disappearing beneath the packed earth of the floor. As he cleared the perimeter, a full rectangle emerged, perfectly aligned with the walls of the room. The proportions were wrong for a simple cellar entrance, too thick, too precise, too heavy. Running his fingers along the edge, he felt the narrow groove where the door met its frame. The seam was tight, almost seamless despite the corrosion, and the surrounding earth had been packed and repacked over time, as though someone had taken care to keep the threshold hidden and protected. In one corner, he found the faint outline of a recessed handle, folded flat against the surface, nearly invisible beneath rust and grime. The realization that this door had been meant to stay closed settled over him with quiet force. Everything about it spoke of intention. The rug that concealed it, the reinforced floor built around it, the way the sod house itself seemed positioned not as a dwelling, but as a shield. This was an entrance that existed only for those who already knew it was there. He stood and surveyed the room again, seeing it now through a different lens. The table was not simply a place to work, but a staging area. The shelves were not for comfort, but for readiness. The room was an intermediary space, a threshold between the open world and something buried far deeper. He began to notice details he had overlooked before. Narrow channels cut into the stone near the walls, subtle enough to be mistaken for cracks, formed a loose pattern that converged towards the center of the room. Ventilation, he realized, air drawn down, guided, controlled. The system was crude by modern standards, but effective, and it confirmed what the door had already suggested. Whatever lay beneath was not shallow, and it was not small. The question of opening it pressed at the edges of his thoughts, but he resisted acting on impulse. Years of working the land had taught him the value of preparation, of understanding before intervention. He stepped outside again, letting the daylight ground him, and walked the perimeter of the structure once more. This time he followed the stonework more closely. Where the walls met the ridge, he traced the seams with his eyes, noting where stone blocks had been fitted so tightly that even roots had difficulty finding purchase. In several places, he found narrow vertical gaps disguised as natural fractures in the limestone. Holding his flashlight up to one, he saw faint movement of dust deep within, stirred by air currents. Vent shafts, carefully placed, carefully hidden. The thought unsettled him. This was not the work of someone hiding briefly or acting in desperation. It was the product of planning, labor, and a deep understanding of concealment. Whoever built this place had expected to remain unseen, perhaps indefinitely. Back inside, he examined the door more closely. The hinges were not exposed. Whatever mechanism allowed it to open was internal, protected from tampering and corrosion. He found no obvious locking system on the surface, no padlock or bolt that could be forced easily. Instead, there were faint impressions around the recessed handle, marks left by repeated use long ago. He imagined hands gripping that handle, lifting, descending. Imagined the weight of the door swinging open, the sound it must have made when metal met stone. He imagined it being closed again, sealed, perhaps for the last time. Before attempting anything further, he prepared carefully. He brought additional light sources, tested batteries, and laid out tools in deliberate order. A coil of rope rested near the wall, sturdy enough to bear weight. He pulled on gloves, more out of respect for the age of what he was touching than fear of injury. When he finally returned his focus to the door, the room felt different. Not hostile, but expectant. He folded back the remaining fabric and cleared the last of the soil from the seam. The handle resisted at first, stiff from decades of disuse, but yielded slowly as he applied steady pressure. The sound that followed was low and deep, a metallic groan that echoed briefly before being swallowed by the space below. The door lifted only a few inches before its weight asserted itself, forcing him to adjust his grip and brace his stance. With effort, he raised it enough to reveal darkness beneath, dense and absolute, as if the earth itself had opened its mouth. A rush of air escaped from the opening, cool and dry, carrying a faint scent of stone and iron. It was not the smell of decay or rot, but of preservation. He shone his flashlight downward, and the beam cut through the darkness to strike a set of iron rungs descending into the void. They were fixed firmly into the stone, spaced evenly, disappearing beyond the reach of the light. He paused there, heart steady but alert, allowing himself a moment to absorb the significance of what he was seeing. This was not a simple underground room. It was an access point to something designed to remain hidden, something that extended beyond the surface world in both space and purpose. Before descending, he examined the edges of the opening. The frame was reinforced with thick iron bands anchored into the surrounding stone. The craftsmanship was rough but confident, the work of people accustomed to building with what they had, adapting techniques to their environment. He could see now how the ground above had remained stable for so long, how the weight of the sod house and the ridge itself had been distributed carefully to protect what lay beneath. He secured the rope to a solid beam and tested it, then clipped a second light to his belt. Every movement was deliberate, measured. This was not a place to rush. As he began his descent, the sounds of the surface world faded quickly. The light from above narrowed to a pale rectangle, then to a thin line, before disappearing entirely as the door settled back into place under its own weight. The only illumination now came from his flashlight, its beam revealing stone walls that bore the marks of tools rather than erosion. The latter ended at a narrow landing, opening into a corridor that extended in both directions. The air was still but breathable, confirming the effectiveness of the ventilation he had observed above. The walls were close, the ceiling low enough to force him to bend slightly, reinforcing the sense of compression and concealment. He stood there for a long moment, listening. There were no sounds of movement, no dripping water, no distant echoes. The silence was complete, profound, as if the space had been waiting for his arrival without expectation or urgency. Turning slowly, he swept the light along the corridor, revealing stonework that was more refined than he had anticipated. The walls had been smoothed, reinforced in places with timber supports that, remarkably, showed little sign of rot. The floor was level, worn in subtle places by repeated passage long ago. This was not a cave adapted for use. It was a structure carved and built with intention. He took a single step forward, then another, the beam of his light moving ahead of him as the corridor opened into a larger space. The scale of it became apparent gradually, the darkness retreating to reveal a chamber that extended beyond the reach of his flashlight, its boundaries hinted at by vertical supports and the glint of metal deeper within. A sense of awe settled over him, quiet and heavy. The sod house above had been a deception, a mask. The real heart of the place lay here, beneath layers of earth and years of silence, preserved not by accident, but by design. As he moved farther into the underground space, he understood that the questions raised by the land and its hidden structure were only beginning to take shape. The door he had opened was not an ending, but a threshold, and whatever waited in the darkness ahead would demand more than curiosity. It would demand understanding, patience, and a willingness to confront a past that had been deliberately buried. Behind him, unseen, the iron door rested once more in its frame, sealing the surface world away. Ahead, the subterranean chamber waited, vast and intact, holding the weight of a story that had been cut off from daylight for generations, yet had lost none of its power to be revealed. The chamber revealed itself gradually, as though reluctant to surrender its full dimensions all at once. His light moved across stone and timber, catching on edges, retreating into shadow, then returning to illuminate details that reshaped his understanding of the space with each step forward. What had first appeared to be a single open room resolved instead into a carefully organized underground structure, its scale disguised by darkness and its logic revealed only through movement. The air was cool but not oppressive. It carried the neutral scent of stone, old wood, and iron, untouched by rot or stagnant moisture. Each breath confirmed what the ventilation shafts above had promised. This place had been designed to remain habitable. He paused often, listening for any change in sound, any sign that the space resisted intrusion. Nothing answered him. The silence was complete, not empty but contained, as if held in place by the surrounding rock. As his eyes adjusted, he began to discern the layout. The corridor opened into a central area that functioned as a junction, from which narrower passages extended in measured directions. The floor beneath his boots was not raw earth, but compacted and leveled, worn smooth along certain paths by repeated passage long ago. The wear patterns were subtle but unmistakable, a quiet record of daily movement preserved beneath the surface. He followed one of the passages and emerged into a smaller room whose purpose became clear almost immediately. Along the walls stood the remnants of sleeping arrangements, wooden frames fixed directly into the stone, their surfaces darkened by age and use. In some places, scraps of fabric still clung to the wood, brittle and faded, suggesting mattresses or blankets long since reduced to fragments. The spacing between the frames told a story of shared confinement, of bodies arranged with efficiency rather than comfort. The room did not feel abandoned in the careless sense. Nothing had been scattered or stripped away. Instead, it carried the quiet order of a place left behind intentionally, its contents deemed either too heavy, too personal, or too revealing to remove. He imagined the people who had slept here, rising in the dim light of oil lamps or candles, careful to make as little noise as possible, their routines shaped by the knowledge that the world above could not be trusted. Beyond the sleeping area lay another chamber, larger and more densely arranged. Shelving units lined the walls, some collapsed under their own weight, others still standing stubbornly upright. On them rested containers of various sizes. Wooden crates reinforced with iron bands, glass jars clouded with age, metal tins sealed tightly against air and moisture. Many were empty now, their contents consumed long ago, but enough remained to suggest the scale of preparation that had taken place. He examined a crate near the entrance and found its lid loose. Inside lay the residue of dry goods reduced to dust, but the interior was remarkably intact. No signs of water damage, no evidence of animals. The seal had held. This realization sent a quiet shock through him. This place had not been merely hidden. It had been protected, maintained, and then sealed with care. Moving deeper, he noticed how the chambers flowed into one another without wasted space. Each area served a distinct function. Workspaces appeared next, identifiable by benches scarred with tool marks and shelves holding rusted implements arranged by size and purpose. There were tools here he recognized immediately, adapted for stone, wood, and metal, alongside others whose specific use was less obvious but clearly deliberate. Nothing felt improvised. Even repairs bore the mark of methodical planning. He traced the ventilation system as best he could from within, following the subtle channels carved into the stone near the ceiling. They converged and diverged, feeding air into each chamber in measured amounts. In several places, simple wooden shutters had been installed, allowing airflow to be adjusted or cut off entirely. This was not a crude solution born of desperation. It was a system refined over time, altered as needs changed, maintained with discipline. In a narrow side room he found evidence of water management. Shallow grooves ran along the floor, guiding moisture toward a central drain that disappeared into the stone. The craftsmanship was rough but effective, designed to keep the living areas dry even in seasons of heavy rain. He could see where sediment had been cleared repeatedly, where someone had taken responsibility for the ongoing survival of the space rather than assuming it would endure without care. The further he moved, the stronger the sense of long-term habitation became. This was not a hideout used briefly and abandoned at the first sign of trouble. It was a place where people had planned to live, to endure. The architecture reflected that mindset everywhere. Reinforcements appeared where the rock weakened. Additional supports had been added where time had revealed stress. This was a living structure, shaped and reshaped by those who depended on it. He returned to the central junction and followed another passage, this one leading to a storage area set slightly apart from the rest. The air here felt marginally cooler, the stone walls thicker. Racks held metal containers sealed with wax and cloth, their labels faded but still legible in places. Dates marked the passage of time, each line a reminder that supplies had been monitored carefully, rationed, and replenished whenever possible. In one corner, he found a collection of personal items stored together, distinct from the practical goods. Small objects, carefully wrapped and placed side by side, spoke of lives lived under constraint. A broken comb, a child's carved toy smoothed by countless touches, a stack of folded paper tied with string, set apart as something worth preserving even when space and safety were at a premium. The presence of these items shifted his perception of the bunker from an engineering feat to a human refuge. As he moved through the chambers, he began to understand how the sod house above fit into the larger design. It was not simply an entrance, it was a decoy, a buffer between the underground world and the surface. Anyone stumbling upon it would see a modest, abandoned structure and likely move on. Only those who knew where to look would find the door beneath the floor, and only those who understood its weight and purpose would open it. The realization brought with it a deeper respect for the builders. They had anticipated not only discovery, but misunderstanding. They had relied on the assumptions of others to protect what mattered most. The simplicity of the surface hid the complexity below, and time had only strengthened that illusion. In the farthest chamber he explored, he found signs of communal life that transcended mere survival. Marks on the walls suggested schedules or tallies once drawn in charcoal or chalk, now mostly erased. A section of stone bore shallow carvings, symbols worn smooth by hands that had traced them repeatedly. These were not decorative. They felt functional, mnemonic, perhaps tied to rules, rituals, or shared memory. He stood there for a long time, light resting on the carvings, trying to imagine the rhythm of days lived underground, a careful balance between isolation and cooperation, constant vigilance required to remain unseen, a psychological toll of choosing concealment over confrontation. This place had not only sheltered bodies, it had shaped minds. Eventually, fatigue reminded him that time still moved above ground, even if it seemed suspended here. He retraced his steps slowly, committing details to memory, resisting the urge to touch more than necessary. There was an instinct now to preserve rather than disturb, to observe without claiming. When he returned to the ladder and climbed back toward the sod house, the transition felt abrupt. The narrow opening framed a patch of daylight that seemed almost artificial after the controlled darkness below. As the iron door settled back into place behind him, sealing the bunker once more, he felt a shift inside himself. He was no longer merely the owner of land with unusual features. He had become a witness. Outside, the ridge stood as it always had, quiet and unassuming. Grass stirred in the breeze. Birds moved through the trees without regard for what lay beneath their feet. Yet the land no longer felt empty. It felt layered, inhabited by the weight of decisions made long before he arrived. As he stepped away from the hidden structure and back into the open field, he understood that what he had found was only the physical framework of a much larger story. The bunker spoke of preparation, of endurance, of a deliberate withdrawal from the surface world, but it did not yet explain who had lived there, why they had chosen this path, or what had ultimately driven them to leave everything behind. Those answers, he sensed, were waiting somewhere within the objects he had seen, but not yet examined closely. In the papers tied with string, in the dates marked on containers, in the careful order that still governed the space below. The structure had shown him how they lived. The next step would reveal who they were and why their presence had been erased so completely that even the land itself seemed hesitant to remember. With that understanding, he turned his attention back toward the sod house one last time before leaving. It remained motionless, absorbed into the ridge, doing exactly what it had been built to do. Guarding the truth beneath it, patient and unyielding, until someone was willing to look beyond the surface and accept the responsibility that came with uncovering what had been hidden for far too long. The following days unfolded with a new gravity. What he had seen beneath the ridge no longer allowed him the comfort of treating the land as a blank canvas for future plans. Each task on the surface now carried an undercurrent of awareness, as if every step pressed against layers of unseen history. He found himself measuring time differently, dividing his attention between what needed to be done above ground and what waited patiently below, untouched and unchanged. He returned to the sod house with intention rather than curiosity. This time he brought with him not just light and tools, but containers, gloves, and a quiet resolve to understand rather than merely observe. The iron door yielded again with the same reluctant groan, and the descent felt familiar now, though no less solemn. The bunker received him as before, silent and intact, its air steady and uncomplaining. He moved past the sleeping chambers and work areas, following an instinct that guided him toward the side room where he had noticed the personal items. There, set apart from tools and supplies, he found what he had sensed from the beginning: an archive. Not a formal one, not organized according to any institutional standard, but a deliberate collection of records preserved with care and purpose. Wooden boxes were stacked along the wall, their surfaces darkened by age, but reinforced with metal corners that had spared them from collapse. They were wrapped in layers of cloth and waxed paper, each bundle tied with string that had grown stiff but held fast. The effort invested in their protection was unmistakable. Whoever sealed this place had understood the fragility of what lay inside and had taken pains to ensure its survival. He chose one box at random and lifted the lid slowly. Inside lay stacks of paper, some folded, others bound together with twine. The pages were yellowed but surprisingly intact, the ink faded yet legible. The smell of old paper rose gently, dry and clean, untouched by mold or decay. It was the scent of preservation, of time held at bay. As he examined the contents, patterns began to emerge. These were not official records in the bureaucratic sense, but they were meticulous. Lists of names appeared again and again, written in different hands across different years. Dates were marked carefully, often accompanied by brief notes. Births, illnesses, supplies received or consumed, movements recorded in cautious language that avoided specifics but conveyed urgency. He set the papers aside and opened another box. This one contained photographs, carefully wrapped in cloth and stacked with cardboard separators between them. He removed them one by one, holding each up to the light. Faces stared back at him from another century, their expressions solemn, unsmiling, shaped by the conventions of early photography and the weight of circumstance. The photographs showed groups rather than individuals. Families posed together, standing stiffly in front of simple structures or open fields. Children clustered close to adults, their small hands resting on sleeves or gripping each other for balance. The backgrounds repeated themselves across different images, suggesting a shared place, a shared life. In several photographs, he recognized features of the sod house above ground, its outline clearer before it had been fully absorbed by the ridge. On the backs of the photographs, names and dates had been written carefully in pencil or ink. Some were clear, others smudged by time, but enough remained to form connections. He began to recognize repeated surnames, recurring across decades. These were not isolated settlers passing through. These were families bound together by proximity and circumstance, living in deliberate association. A third box held bound notebooks. Their covers were worn smooth, corners rounded by handling. He opened the first and found a journal, its pages filled with compact handwriting that shifted subtly as entries progressed. The early pages were practical, almost hopeful, describing construction efforts, the challenge of working stone and earth, the satisfaction of creating a place that could not be easily found. As the entries continued, the tone changed. The writing grew tighter, more cautious. References to the outside world became less frequent and more guarded. There were mentions of visitors seen at a distance, of sounds heard at night that prompted the closing of vents and the extinguishing of lamps. The language avoided naming specific threats, but the fear was unmistakable, threaded through even the most mundane observations. He read on, carefully, aware that each page represented a voice long silenced. The journals spoke of adaptation, of rules established to maintain safety and order underground. They described schedules for ventilation, rationing plans, strategies for limited contact with the surface world. There was discipline here, but also strain. The writers wrestled with doubt, with the weight of isolation, with the cost of choosing concealment over confrontation. In another notebook, written years later in a different hand, the perspective shifted. The writer spoke as someone who had grown up in the bunker rather than chosen it. The entries carried a sense of normalcy shaped by constraint. The underground chambers were described not as hiding places, but as home. The surface world existed as rumor and memory, filtered through stories told by elders and rare, cautious glimpses of daylight. The generational continuity struck him deeply. This was not a single moment of crisis captured and preserved. It was a sustained way of life, passed down, normalized, and maintained over decades. Children were born here. They learned rules before they learned freedom. They inherited not just the shelter, but the fear that justified it. He returned to the lists of names with new understanding. The repetition of surnames now read as lineage rather than coincidence. Birth dates followed one another in measured succession. There were records of marriages noted simply and without ceremony. Deaths, too, appeared, though rarely and with minimal detail. No mention of burials, no indication of where the dead were laid to rest. Only dates and initials, as if the act of recording was itself an act of restraint. One bundle of papers stood apart from the rest. It was smaller, wrapped more tightly, sealed with care. When he opened it, he found correspondence. Letters written but never sent, their addresses left blank or scratched out. The language was cautious, even apologetic, as if the writers understood that reaching outward carried risks they could not afford. Some letters described disputes over land, pressure from authorities, unnamed groups demanding compliance or departure. Others spoke of decisions made collectively, of choosing concealment over exposure. The writers wrestled with the morality of their choice, aware that disappearing from official records meant surrendering recognition, rights, and protection. Yet the alternative, whatever it had been, was clearly considered worse. As he pieced the fragments together, a clearer picture began to form. These families had not fled randomly or retreated out of eccentricity. They had been pushed, gradually and persistently, into a corner where the only remaining option was to remove themselves from view. The bunker was not merely a refuge from nature, but from society itself. The final pages of the journals were the hardest to read. The entries became sporadic, dates skipping months, then years. Supplies grew scarce, rules tightened, mentions of vent closures and extended periods without surface access increased. The writers spoke of watching the world above change from a distance, of recognizing that returning openly was no longer possible. And then the writing stopped. There was no final explanation, no dramatic account of catastrophe. The last entry ended mid-thought, the ink trailing off as if the writer had been interrupted or had chosen, suddenly, to stop. The absence of closure was more unsettling than any explicit tragedy could have been. It suggested not a single decisive end, but a gradual unraveling, a point at which recording the truth no longer felt safe or useful. He closed the notebook and sat back, the weight of what he had learned settling over him. The bunker was no longer just an impressive feat of hidden construction. It was a record of lives lived under pressure, of choices made in fear and maintained through discipline. The disappearance of these families was not a mystery in the conventional sense. It was the outcome of a long process, one that left no dramatic trace on the surface but reshaped everything beneath it. As he carefully returned the documents to their boxes, he felt a growing sense of responsibility. These were not artifacts to be admired from a distance. They were evidence of existence, of erasure. The land he owned now held not only soil and stone, but the documented memory of people who had been forced to choose invisibility as a means of survival. When he finally sealed the boxes again and stood to leave, the bunker felt different. Less like a hidden space waiting to be discovered, and more like a vault that had fulfilled its purpose too well. It had protected its contents, preserved them beyond the reach of time and indifference. But it had also ensured that the truth remained buried, unseen, for far longer than anyone inside could have intended. As he climbed back toward the surface, the question that pressed against his thoughts was no longer what this place was or how it had been built. It was what had ultimately happened to the people who recorded their lives so carefully, only to vanish from history without a trace. The answer, he sensed, would not be found in the bunker alone. It would require looking outward, beyond the ridge, into the official records and silent spaces of the world that had driven these families underground in the first place. The knowledge he carried back to the surface weighed more than the boxes of documents he had left below. It followed him into the open air, into the ordinary light of day, and settled over the land with a presence that could not be ignored. The ridge no longer appeared merely ancient and quiet. It felt complicit, shaped not only by geology but by human choice, by the accumulated pressure of lives pushed inward until stone and soil became their last refuge. He did not rush to tell anyone what he had found. The instinct to speak, to share the discovery, was tempered by what the journals had taught him. Words had consequences. Visibility carried risks. The people who built the bunker had learned that lesson at great cost, and he was not prepared to disregard it lightly. Instead, he turned to records, to the scattered fragments of official memory that existed beyond the ridge. His search began locally. County archives, digitized records, aging newspapers scanned and indexed by volunteers long after the events they described. He worked patiently, cross-referencing names from the journals with whatever traces he could find. The results were uneven, frustratingly incomplete. Some names appeared briefly in census rolls, then vanished. Others surfaced only once, attached to land deeds or minor legal disputes, before disappearing again without explanation. What struck him most was not the presence of gaps, but their consistency. Entire families seemed to fade out of the record at roughly the same time. The phrasing used to describe their absence was vague and interchangeable. Moved on. Location unknown. No further contact. There were no death certificates, no probate records, no formal acknowledgement that these people had ceased to exist. The bureaucracy had not recorded an ending. It had simply stopped looking. As he traced the timelines forward, he began to see the pattern more clearly. The late 19th and early 20th centuries were filled with upheaval in this region, land consolidation, shifting property laws, enforcement actions that favored those with recognized titles and political connections, families living on marginal land, especially those who existed outside established systems of power, were vulnerable. Disputes over boundaries and ownership were often resolved not through courts, but through pressure and intimidation that left little paper trail. The journals guarded references to visitors, and demands took on new meaning. These people had not gone underground because of a single threat. They had been eroded by a series of forces, each one insufficient on its own to justify total withdrawal, but together impossible to withstand. The bunker was the culmination of that erosion, a last assertion of control in a landscape that had ceased to offer protection. He found brief newspaper notices that hinted at trouble without elaboration. Mentions of unsettled claims. Reports of families abandoning holdings near the ridge. In one instance, a short article described a cluster of homes found empty, their occupants gone without notice. The tone was casual, almost dismissive, as though such disappearances were an inconvenience rather than a tragedy. No follow-up appeared in later issues. The absence of investigation was itself revealing. At a time when authorities were eager to enforce laws and assert control over land, the disappearance of entire families should have prompted inquiry. Instead, the records suggested relief. Vacated land simplified matters. It removed complications. Silence served administrative efficiency. He compared the official timelines with the dates recorded in the bunker. The overlap was undeniable. The final journal entries coincided with the period when surface references to these families ceased altogether. It was not that the people below had suddenly vanished. It was that the world above had moved on without them, closing ranks and records in equal measure. Yet one question remained unresolved. If the bunker had been used for decades, if generations had lived and grown old beneath the ridge, why did the journals stop when they did? Why was there no record of death, no final accounting, no explanation for the empty sleeping spaces and abandoned supplies? He returned again to the last entries, reading them with fresh eyes. The tone had shifted subtly, not toward panic, but toward constraint. Mentions of vent closures grew more frequent. Surface access was restricted for longer periods. There were references to listening and waiting, to a need for absolute stillness. Whatever pressure had driven them underground had not dissipated. It had intensified. The possibility that they had been discovered lingered at the edges of his thoughts, but the physical evidence did not support a violent confrontation. There were no signs of forced entry, no damage consistent with an assault. The bunker had remained sealed, preserved, its contents intact. If discovery had occurred, it had not taken the form of an invasion. Another possibility emerged slowly, reluctantly. The people below may have chosen to leave. The idea felt counterintuitive at first. Why abandon a refuge that had sustained them for so long? Why leave behind supplies, records, and the accumulated labor of generations? Yet, the journals hinted at a growing awareness that remaining hidden indefinitely was not sustainable. Supplies dwindled. Children born underground would eventually demand more than concealment could provide. The world above had changed, and isolation, once a solution, may have become a trap. He searched for evidence of an alternate exit, some secondary passage that would allow the families to depart without using the main entrance beneath the sod house. His exploration of the bunker had revealed no obvious route, but he began to reconsider the structure with this new question in mind. The ventilation shafts, though narrow, were numerous and extended far into the ridge. It was conceivable that one or more had been widened, adapted, or repurposed over time. Returning to the underground chambers with this perspective, he examined the farthest rooms again. In one area, he noticed subtle differences in the stonework. A section of wall bore tool marks that were newer than the surrounding surfaces, the edges less softened by time. The floor nearby showed wear inconsistent with the rest of the chamber, as though something heavy had been dragged across it repeatedly. Beyond that point, the stone changed character. The walls grew rougher, less finished, transitioning gradually from constructed space to something more natural. He followed the passage carefully, noting how the air moved differently there, drawn toward a narrow opening that disappeared into shadow. The opening was not large, not a tunnel that could be walked through upright. It was a crawl space, its edges worn smooth by repeated passage. He did not attempt to follow it far, mindful of safety, but the implication was clear. The bunker had not been a closed system. It had been connected to the ridge itself, offering a route that bypassed the sod house entirely. This discovery reframed the final absence recorded in the journals. The families had not necessarily died below. They may have left quietly, carrying only what they could manage, abandoning the rest to avoid detection. The bunker, sealed and undisturbed, became not a tomb, but a time capsule of the life they had outgrown or been forced to abandon. The lack of surface records for these people after their disappearance took on a new significance. If they had emerged elsewhere, far from the ridge, they may have done so under new names, in places where their past could not follow them. Reinvention was often the only form of survival available to those pushed beyond the margins. Yet, even this explanation carried its own weight of loss. To leave was to sever continuity, to erase oneself from history deliberately. The journals ended not because life ended, but because recording it became too dangerous, too revealing. Silence became the final strategy. Standing once more at the base of the ridge, he felt the convergence of past and present with acute clarity. The land he owned had not been cursed or abandoned out of superstition. It had been shaped by fear, resilience, and, ultimately, disappearance chosen over destruction. The families who lived beneath it had solved their immediate problem at the cost of their place in the historical record. The understanding unsettled him more than any notion of tragedy confined underground. It meant that the land had not simply hidden their lives, it had outlasted them, carrying forward without acknowledgment, passed from owner to owner with no obligation to remember what had been given up beneath its surface. As the light shifted across the ridge, he recognized that he now stood at a similar crossroads. He had uncovered evidence of lives erased by circumstance and choice. He understood why the land had been treated as undesirable, why its price had remained low, why each previous owner had stayed only briefly. Knowledge, once acquired, was difficult to carry alone. The question was no longer what had happened to the disappeared families. It was what should be done with the truth they had left behind, and whether bringing it into the open would honor their struggle or repeat the pressures that had driven them into hiding in the first place. Once the possibility of departure had taken root in his mind, the land itself seemed to offer confirmation at every turn. What he had once interpreted as neglect or simple misfortune now revealed itself as a pattern shaped by avoidance. The truth of the bunker explained the past, but it also cast a long shadow over the present, illuminating the choices of those who had come after. He turned his attention to the ownership history of the property, this time with patience and persistence rather than casual curiosity. The chain of deeds was intact, yet strangely abbreviated. Names appeared, held the land briefly, then vanished from the record as quietly as the families before them. No one had stayed long enough to establish deep roots. There were no generational transfers, no long-term leases, no signs of commitment beyond a few short years at most. The timing was too consistent to ignore. One owner held the land for 7 years, another for 5, another for barely 3. Each transaction was followed by a sale that undercut the market just enough to ensure quick interest, just enough to pass the burden along without questions. The land moved from hand to hand like an object no one wanted to examine too closely. He began searching beyond the deeds themselves, looking for traces of intent in the margins. Old loan documents referenced the property with unusual caution. Banks assigned conservative valuations, often lower than surrounding parcels without clear justification. Insurance records included clauses that felt out of place, disclaimers regarding subsurface irregularities, and unrecorded features that bordered on the absurd in their vagueness. At first glance, these clauses appeared generic, the kind of legal language designed to protect institutions from unlikely contingencies. But when viewed in the context of the bunker, they took on sharper meaning. Someone, at some point, had known enough to be careful without stating why. He followed the trail into correspondence, digging through archived letters and scanned documents connected loosely to previous owners. Most were mundane, concerned with taxes, boundaries, and maintenance. But scattered among them were hints of unease. A letter requesting clarification about ground stability near the ridge. A complaint about equipment damage attributed vaguely to unexpected subsurface conditions. A note expressing concern about features not disclosed at purchase, followed by silence. The pattern repeated itself with subtle variations. Each owner encountered something that unsettled them. Not enough to provoke public action, not enough to justify legal confrontation, but sufficient to erode confidence. And rather than investigate further, they chose the simplest solution. They left. He spoke again with neighbors, this time with more direct questions. The responses were measured, careful. People remembered previous owners vaguely, if at all. Some recalled equipment sitting idle for long periods, then being sold off. Others remembered sudden departures, properties listed quietly, without fanfare. No one spoke of the ridge itself in concrete terms, but there was an unspoken understanding that the land was difficult. What emerged was not a conspiracy, but a shared habit of disengagement. The land inspired enough discomfort to discourage long-term investment, yet not enough to demand explanation. It existed in a gray area where silence was easier than inquiry. Each owner inherited not just acreage, but an unarticulated expectation to look away. He returned to the documents from the bunker with this understanding in mind. The sealed boxes, the careful preservation, the deliberate concealment. The families who built the underground refuge had anticipated scrutiny, had prepared for pressure, and had ultimately chosen disappearance as their defense. Those who came later, lacking that context but sensing its residue, had made a similar choice on a smaller scale. They did not build bunkers, they simply moved on. The realization carried a strange symmetry. The land had taught avoidance as a survival strategy, first to those who hid beneath it, then to those who briefly possessed it. In both cases, silence had been the preferred response to uncertainty. He found one particularly telling piece of evidence in an old handwritten letter tucked into a county file, misfiled and nearly illegible. It was addressed not to an institution, but to a previous owner, written by someone who had sold the land before him. The language was careful, indirect. It warned against digging too deeply near the ridge. It mentioned things better left undisturbed. It did not explain why. The letter ended with a simple suggestion. If the land proved troublesome, sell it quickly, and do not ask questions that could not be answered cleanly. There it was. The inheritance no one had named. Not money or structures, but knowledge expressed through omission. Each transfer of ownership passed along a warning without words, a lesson learned and quietly handed off. The land's low price was not merely a market anomaly. It was a discount attached to uncertainty, a reduction that compensated buyers for assuming a risk they did not yet understand. He began to see his own purchase differently. He had been drawn by the numbers, by the promise of opportunity, but what he had actually acquired was a responsibility deferred by generations. The truth beneath the ridge had been pressing upward for decades, shaping behavior without revealing itself fully. Now it had reached someone who was willing, perhaps unwisely, to listen. The weight of that realization settled slowly. He understood now why the land had felt restless even before the sod house revealed itself. It had been carrying unresolved history, passed along through avoidance rather than confrontation. Each owner had chosen personal relief over collective reckoning, and, in doing so, had perpetuated the silence. As he stood at the edge of the field, looking toward the ridge, he felt the tension between two impulses. One urged him to do what others had done, to acknowledge the difficulty, recognize the cost, and walk away. The market would bear it. The land would sell. Someone else would take his place, inherit the same unspoken burden, and perhaps repeat the cycle once more. The other impulse was heavier, slower, and far more demanding. It asked him to remain, to accept that ownership in this case meant stewardship of a truth that extended beyond personal interest. The families who built the bunker had not intended to create a mystery for future generations. They had intended to survive. Their silence had been strategic, not shameful. But the silence that followed, the one maintained by convenience and fear, had turned survival into erasure. He could feel the land waiting, not actively, but with the quiet patience of something that had endured far longer than any individual. The question it posed was not urgent, but it was unavoidable. Would he continue the pattern, or would he finally interrupt it? As evening settled and the ridge darkened against the sky, he understood that the decision he faced was not about property or profit. It was about whether the inheritance of silence would end with him, or whether it would be passed along once more, intact and unchallenged, to whoever came next. By the time he accepted that there would be no simple resolution, the land had already claimed a deeper place in his thinking than any property ever had before. It was no longer something he merely owned or worked. It had become a question he carried with him, shaping his days even when he tried to focus on ordinary tasks. Every decision now seemed to echo outward, touching not only his own future but the unresolved past embedded beneath the ridge. He understood, with a clarity that left little room for denial, that the discovery was not an accident meant only for his curiosity. The sod house, the sealed door, the bunker, and the archive beneath it had survived precisely because no one before him had stayed long enough to confront them fully. Others had sensed the weight of the place and chosen distance as a form of self-preservation. He had done the opposite, and that choice carried obligations he could not pretend away. The first and most immediate realization was that this was not simply a remarkable find. It was evidence. The journals, photographs, and records documented lives deliberately erased from public memory. They showed not only how people had lived beneath the ridge, but why they had felt compelled to vanish. To treat these materials as curiosities or personal possessions would be to repeat the same quiet injustice that had followed the families for more than a century. At the same time, he could not ignore what public exposure might bring. He had seen enough of how institutions responded to inconvenient truths to know that good intentions did not guarantee respectful outcomes. If authorities became involved, the land could be seized or restricted, the bunker reclassified as a historical site, its contents removed and cataloged by people with little patience for nuance. The family's story, once controlled and preserved with care, could be flattened into a headline or reduced to a footnote stripped of its human complexity. He imagined the consequences with unsettling clarity. Surveyors and officials marking off sections of his field, journalists speculating freely, filling gaps with conjecture, tourists drawn by fascination rather than understanding. The ridge itself transformed from a place of quiet endurance into a spectacle. The thought left him uneasy, not because he feared losing the land, but because he feared losing the dignity of the story it contained. Yet, sealing the bunker again and choosing silence carried its own cost. Doing nothing would align him with the long line of owners who had benefited, however indirectly, from avoidance. It would preserve his comfort at the expense of truth. He would continue farming, perhaps prosper, all while knowing that beneath his feet lay a meticulously documented history of people who had been denied recognition even in their disappearance. The land, in that scenario, would remain cheap not just in market value, but in moral terms. Its story would stay buried, and the inheritance of silence would pass through him unchanged. As days passed, he found himself returning again and again to the journal's final pages. The abrupt ending no longer felt like a mystery to be solved, but a boundary drawn intentionally. The families had chosen when to stop recording themselves. They had understood that survival sometimes required erasure, but they had also preserved enough for someone, someday, to understand what had been lost. That someone, he realized, was now him. The responsibility was not to speak recklessly, nor to remain mute, but to choose a path that honored both the fear that had driven the families underground and the resilience that had sustained them there. The story did not belong to institutions or audiences hungry for revelation. It belonged to the people who had lived it, and, by extension, to the land that had sheltered them. He began to consider a quieter form of action: preservation rather than exposure, documentation without spectacle. He secured the bunker carefully, improving its stability without altering its structure. He cataloged the contents thoroughly, creating records that could survive even if the physical materials someday could not. He consulted historians discreetly, not for publicity but for guidance on ethical preservation, seeking counsel from those who understood that some histories required patience and restraint. The decision did not absolve him of risk. Even discretion carried the possibility of discovery. But it allowed him to remain present rather than retreating into the familiar comfort of denial. It allowed him to act as a steward rather than an owner in the narrow sense. Gradually, his relationship with the land changed again. Farming resumed its rhythm, but with a heightened awareness of what lay beneath. The ridge no longer felt like an obstacle or a mystery. It felt like a boundary between worlds, one visible and one hidden, both deserving care. The soil above the bunker grew crops as it always had, nourished by the same rain and sun, unaware of the layered history it supported. He understood now why the land had always been undervalued, not because it was unproductive, but because it carried truth that demanded more than transactional ownership. It asked something personal from those who held it. Most had declined to answer. As seasons passed, the urgency he once felt softened into resolve. The land did not demand immediate confession or dramatic reckoning. It asked for continuity, for respect, for the refusal to erase what had already been erased once. In choosing to stay, to learn, and to preserve, he broke the pattern not through confrontation, but through presence. Standing at the ridge one evening, watching light fade across the fields, he felt the weight of the past settle into something steadier, less oppressive. The silence that once defined the land no longer felt like avoidance. It felt intentional, chosen not out of fear, but out of care. The bunker remained sealed, not forgotten, but protected. The families who had lived there were no longer invisible, even if their story was not shouted into the world. The inheritance he had received was not the land itself, but the choice of what to do with what it contained. By refusing to pass that choice along untouched, he altered the future of the place in a way no deed ever could. The ridge stood unchanged, ancient and patient. Beneath it, the preserved chambers waited, no longer as a burden of silence, but as a testament held in trust. And above it, life continued, grounded not in ignorance, but in the quiet understanding that some truths endure best when they are guarded with care rather than consumed by noise. The land was no longer cheap, not because its price had risen, but because its value had finally been acknowledged. If this story made you think, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what comes next. More hidden stories, forgotten places, and real discoveries are waiting in our other videos. Share this video with someone who loves true stories buried in history.